Hello there, people of the internet. Normally, whenever I make a video talking about 223 and 5.56 ammunition, depending on the topic it is that we're talking about, I'll use those cartridges pretty much interchangeably, just because the differences between the cartridges don't matter much for that particular video with whatever topic it is that we're discussing. And normally whenever I do that, I get at least one person that goes into the comments and tells me, hey, you're wrong, 223 and 5.56 are not the same cartridge. So for the people who say that, I'm going to go ahead and make this video that goes fully in depth on 223 versus 5.56. So I don't really know where to start with this, so I guess let's go ahead and start with the velocity numbers that you can come to expect. So normally with 223, like what I got right here, this is Winchester 223. This stuff is very, what's the word I'm looking for? Predominant on the market. Typically, if somebody has fired 223 or 9mm, odds are they have ran a white box of Winchester ammunition. So normally with 223 ammunition, you're going to see some pretty high velocities on this stuff. Velocities are going to advertise, in the case of this right here, at 3,240 feet per second. Now, of course, that is an average feet per second. You're going to have some variations from like batch of ammo to batch of ammo, or even cartridge to cartridge, and some of those variations could vary up to like 100 feet per second. It all really depends on the quality of the 223 ammunition that you buy. Like if you get match grade ammunition where everything is much more consistent than something like this cheapo bulk range stuff, then you're probably going to get more consistency and more accuracy as a result. But the velocities achieved with your 223 ammunition is more often than not achieved from a 24-inch barrel. And people say all 223 is achieved, or all 223 velocity is achieved from a 24-inch barrel, but that's just not the case. And the reason why they use a 24-inch barrel is simply so they can get as much velocity as possible to put onto the box. And that right there is kind of one of the, what's the word I'm looking for? Shady business practices whenever it comes to companies like Winchester. They know that most people aren't using a 24-inch barrel 5.56 rifle, but they still use that 24-inch in an attempt to go ahead and make the ammunition seem like it's flying a lot faster than it normally would be. Most of us are going to be using a... Oh, one second. I got my AR stuck on my Khyber Pass Lee Enfield here. Most of us are going to be using a 16-inch barrel AR like what I got right here. And from a 16-inch barrel, your 223 ammunition, 55 grain stuff, is going to be moving more at like 2,900 feet per second. And there's companies out there that know that you're going to be running this stuff from a 16-inch barrel, and they'll actually advertise 16-inch barrel velocities. Like this PMC Bronze I got right here. It runs at 2,900 feet per second advertised on the box. And if you run it through a 16-inch barrel, that's exactly the velocity that you're going to get. Now, versus something like 5.56, if you go out and you get yourself a box of 5.56 ammunition, and I don't actually have a box of 5.56 to show you guys because I mostly shoot 223 just for like barrel life. The lower pressure is easier on the brass. It doesn't quite fling it as far. The actual lifespan of the gun and the springs and all those things. Just I roll with 223 mostly, unless I'm in a situation where I actually have to utilize my ammo for a practical purpose. But most of the time, where did I put it? Most of the time, your 5.56, your actual mil spec, like M193 55 grain 5.56, the velocity for those is going to be rated from a 20-inch barrel like what I have on my M16 inspired build right here. And the reason why they went with a 20-inch is simply because this right here is the military barrel length. The military doesn't use 24-inch barrels for their 5.56 platforms, at least not as a standard issue firearm. And back whenever 5.56 was first being adopted, they were using the M16 rifles. So 20-inch barrel just kind of became the standard for testing the velocities of this ammunition. And normally from a 20-inch barrel, if you're using 55 grain bullets, you're going to be seeing probably about 3,150 feet per second, potentially even 3,200 feet per second, depending on brand and conditions and consistencies and things like that. But we're just going to go ahead and say 3,200 feet per second. So those velocities from that 20-inch barrel are about the velocities that is advertised from companies like Winchester for their 223 ammo out of a 24-inch barrel. So 5.56 is a spicier cartridge than your 223. Just as a general rule, a 5.56 cartridge is going to be traveling about 100 feet per second faster than a 223 cartridge, even from your longer length barrels. Now, if you go bumping your barrel length up to like, I don't know, 26, maybe even 28-inch barrels, which are very uncommon to find for 5.56, you're going to start getting significantly lower diminishing returns. But that's probably a discussion for another video. But the bottom line, the 5.56 does have ever so slightly more pressure due to things like minor increase in powder inside of the case and minor differences with like neck contours and things like that. But it does have a little bit more pressure than your 223. And as a result, it does go a little bit faster. That being said, the 223 and the 5.56 with that added, 100 feet per second or so. I got the hiccups, guys. I'm sorry. That happens whenever I talk a bunch. That 100 feet per second, for most practical purposes that you or I would ever need a 5.56 to be able to use, that 100 feet per second really is not going to make much of a difference. And if you go and you watch chronograph evidence from somebody shoving 223 and 5.56 through, say, a 20-inch barrel, oftentimes it's less than 100 feet per second difference. It's going to be more like 75 feet per second. And that's just such a minor difference to the point to where I wouldn't even worry about that. If you have a bunch of 223 and you're like, oh no, the 223 isn't as fast or as effective as 5.56, unless you're doing something absolutely spectacular at extraordinarily long distances, then that extra 75 feet per second really is not going to make much of a difference. Now, what really starts to pop up in terms of differences between 223 and 5.56 is whenever you start looking at things like 62 grain bullets. Normally, with 62 grain bullets, you're going to be looking at green tip ammunition, and this is going to be your 5.56 green tip rounds. This is going to be your 5.56 62 grain bullets versus something like 223 62 grain bullets, which tend to be just a straight lead core 62 grain. And as a result of the different densities inside the projectile, you're actually going to have different projectile lengths. Now, since most of us are running like a 1 in 7, 1 in 8, or 1 in 9 twist barrel, that doesn't matter. But there are other barrel twist rates out there, like say a 1 in 10, like what I have in my Ruger Mini 14 here. And this right here actually does not run longer 62 grain bullets very well, but it will run shorter, no, wait, flip that around. It doesn't run the shorter 62 grain bullets well, but it will run the longer green tip rounds fairly decently. Not exactly sub-MOA accuracy levels of decent, but I have made accuracy testing videos with this using green tip ammunition, and it runs it just fine. But then I'll go and I'll use a longer, lighter, or a longer projectile that's also 62 grain, just it's longer because the alloys used to make that particular bullet are different. It's like I'll use copper, or I'll use something with a steel core, or I'll use something to where the bullet is just not, like the material inside the bullet isn't as dense as lead, and so as a result, to achieve that 62 grain bullet mass, that bullet has to be a little bit longer. And because of the 1 in 10 twist rate on my Ruger Mini 14 here, it just doesn't stabilize, and then we have keyhole issues. That's not something that most of us have to worry about, because we don't, for the most part, we don't really utilize anything besides a 1 in 7, 1 in 8, and 1 in 9 twist, and basically all your 62 grain bullets, no matter the bullet length, will stabilize in those. It's just once you hit like 1 in 10 and 1 in 12 twist barrels where you start to see some real significant issues. So if you have a 1 in 10 twist rifle like my Ruger Mini 14 there, maybe something like 5.56 62 grain green tip will work just fine, but then you go and you move to like a commercial 223 62 grain and you're going to start having some issues because it's lead core and it's maybe shorter, or maybe you're moving on to something that's like a solid copper bullet and maybe it's longer. That's one of those things where the commercial side of things and the differences in the commercial market that we have access to really start to show that the civilian market really needs to pay more attention to what it is that they're using versus the military market, where everything is a 1 in 7 twist and it can stabilize pretty much any sort of 5.56 bullet that the military decides to run. through their rifles. Now, all of that being said, a lot of people will tell you that the 62 grain bullets will be moving slower from a 20-inch barrel versus a 16-inch barrel. And maybe back whenever the green tip rounds were being adopted, that was true. But if you go and you watch chronographing of modern day, modern made with modern propellant green tip ammunition, you'll actually notice that 16-inch barrels and 20-inch barrels each achieve the same velocity. They're both going to have these bullets traveling at about 3,000 feet per second. And a lot of that has to do with the pressure curves used by the modern powder and the pressure curve achieving its peak maximum pressure within that 16-inch barrel length. Now, I don't know about 14.5-inch barrels because getting something like that would require like tax stamping and registrations and things like that that I don't necessarily want to get into. So if somebody else has experience with the 14.5-inch barrel and the velocities of your green tip rounds, then by all means let us know down in the comments below. But your 62 grain 5.56 rounds, I don't necessarily know about the 62 grain 223 rounds because I've never chronographed or tested those. But they're going to run at the same velocities from a 20-inch barrel or a 16-inch barrel. And if you don't believe me, you can look up chronograph data on modern-made green tip rounds. Now, there are plenty of other different 5.56 and 223 rounds out there. Like there's 77 grain 5.56 and 223 ammo out there. There's 40 grain projectiles out there. There's tracer ammo. There's like black tip rounds. There's all sorts of stuff out there. We could be sitting here all day talking about these different things. And especially on like the civilian market, like the number of 55 grain, not just full metal jackets, but like polymer tips or hollow points or soft points or match rounds or boat tails, or the amount of options that you have in terms of your bullet selection for your 223 is just overwhelmingly staggering. But I think that most of us, whenever we're shooting a 223 or a 5.56, it's going to be a 55 grain or a 62 grain, just because by a huge margin, those are the most popular rounds. It's going to be a M193 style bullet, like a lead core full metal jacket, or a green tip round by a huge margin. By like a tremendous margin, most of us are going to be shooting those just because that is what is most available and that is what is most common, just because it's a military surplus style of ammunition. And I think that's what most of us are going to be graduating towards, so I think that's where I'm going to draw the line in terms of talking about different kinds of 223 and 5.56 ammo, because as we start talking about different ones, like for example, if I get into, I don't know, 77 grain Hornady VMAX ammo and the different things that goes into what that bullet would and would not be good for. And then I jump to a 55 grain VMAX round. Although they're the same style of bullet, one is obviously heavier than the other, so one's going to have more penetration and the other might be better for... like, we would go down a massive rabbit hole if we just start looking at bullet type and bullet type. But by a pretty huge margin, I think that... we basically covered everything that we have to cover in this particular video. I can't think of a single thing else in terms of the differences of 55 and 62 grain 5.56 versus 223 to go over. Talked about barrel length, talked about velocity, talked about what to expect from each of these rounds. So, all that being said, thanks for watching. I appreciate your time. Like, subscribe, share. Description below is a link to all sorts of stuff. Go check it out. You guys go off, have yourself a fantastic day. I guess I will end with this. The two rounds are pretty much interchangeable in all of your modern firearms. I don't think that there's any modern firearms out there that are just chambered in 223. It's going to be like a 223 wild chambering, which can very easily run both. It's designed to be able to run both 5.56 and 223. Or it's going to be a 5.56 chambering, which of course can run both 5.56 and the lower pressure 223. If you have an older firearm that is chambered just in 223, then maybe you would want to consider just running 223 in that. But I have had a lot of people tell me that that's not really that big of a problem. But just to end my own liability here, I'm just going to say run whatever your gun says on it that you should run. I'd already did the outro. I'll see you guys on the next episode. Been a little while since I've done this. Bonnie and Clyde be damned. Poor man's Garen. It's a shame that bolt-action shotguns aren't more mainstream.